Hello to all of our listeners. My name is Tofay, and today is another great day to be a social worker. Welcome to Social Work Amplified, a podcast hosted by Speak. Speak stands for social policy, education, advocacy, and knowledge. And our mission is to amplify the voices of social workers by providing resources, increasing students' political engagement, and facilitating networking opportunities. Speak would like to gratefully acknowledge the generous support of the Simmons Sisters Fund at Texas Women's Foundation. I would like to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Sarah Crockett. Sarah Crockett is the Director of Public Policy at Texas CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. Sarah grew up in Idaho and has a bachelor's degree in political science from Northwest Nazarene University. She obtained a master's degree in social work from the University of Michigan in social policy and program evaluation in 2010 after gaining experience working on women's issues, domestic violence, and with refugees. Sarah served as Associate Director of the Texas Association for Infant Mental Health prior to joining Texas CASA. Sarah has significant experience advocating for children and youth in foster care, both legislatively and in her role as a CASA volunteer for CASA of Travis County. Sarah lives in Austin with her husband, two adorable boys, and their dog. Hi, Sarah. It's so nice to have you. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So we're going to go into our first question. And I'm always interested to know exactly why people get their master's in social work. So what led you in obtaining your master's in social work?
So I spent my undergraduate career really learning about history and the history of political systems and sort of why, some of the injustices that exist and, really kind of dove into understanding all of the different social problems that we know about, but there weren't a lot of solutions. And so I knew I wanted to go into public policy, but I really wanted to be able to focus on issues of social justice and working on systems that impact people. And so I decided to pursue a macro degree in social work so that I could gain experience on working on policy, but really focused on issues of social justice.
Great. And I do believe that the social work field, it's a really nice balance between learning about some of the issues that we have in society, like the systemic issues, and then it also provides solutions. So you're not necessarily overwhelmed by problem after problem, but you also are given the tools to bring about change, like you mentioned. So I really think that is a good reason for entering the field of social work. So what made you decide, you kind of elaborated on this a little bit, but can you just give us a little bit more insight? What made you decide you wanted to concentrate in macro social work and you didn't take the micro route?
Yeah, I think I always knew that I wanted to do, macro work. I wanted to work in systems. I knew I wanted to sort of interface with kind of political systems and changing policies. And I think also I had some concerns that I wouldn't be able to appropriately set boundaries in a clinical setting. So, one of the unique things about the University of Michigan is that they have a truly macro program. So I did take a couple of clinical courses throughout my time at the University of Michigan and really focused on sort of group dynamics. But I had 2 macro field experiences, and all of my classes were focused on community organizing and policy brief writing and things like that. And so it really prepared me to go into a field that's focused on policy and changing things for the better for children and families and other vulnerable populations.
That's good. Yeah, that's really true. In the social work program, it does give you the skills to work at that macro level, but it also, I believe that the micro skills are very necessary and they're very transferable. and you need them in order to be effective in the macro field. So can you tell us a little bit about Texas CASA? What is the organization all about?
Yeah, so Texas CASA is the statewide membership organization for the local CASA programs. There are 72 CASA programs across Texas, and last year we had over 10,000 volunteers. So CASA is actually the largest volunteer organization in the state. We're really proud of that. We served a little over 28,000 children and youth in foster care last year. So the volunteers are recruited by the local CASA programs, and they're really just people in the community that want to make a difference. And they're appointed by the court to represent the best interests of children and youth in foster care. And so they get to know the child and their family and their teachers, sort of everyone involved in the child welfare case. And they make recommendations to the judge without sort of like any other, political or otherwise like agenda. Like they're really just there to represent what is best for the child. And so it's a really important and unique way to make a really meaningful difference in the life of a child who's been abused or neglected. And so Texas CASA supports the work of the local programs and the volunteers across the state. We do help with marketing and grants and things like that. And then on my team, the public policy team, we work with the state agencies, and we also work at the Capitol, and we basically try to represent the best interests of children at the Capitol. And so we work on legislation that will improve outcomes for children and youth in foster care. We work with a lot of youth who are currently or formerly were in foster care to get their perspectives about what would have made their experiences better or what needs to change. And so it's a really great organization that is just all about making things better for kids who've had a really hard time.
Yeah, I think it's really important for children to have that form of advocacy, especially during that time of their lives where, a lot of their voices go unheard because a lot of people are making decisions for them, and they're not at that point where they even know what exactly is going on. They probably haven't even processed through like maybe the trauma that they're going through. So it's really important to like have that advocacy. So I was just wondering, does every child in the foster care system get this CASA appointed individual, or is it like, does a child chooses it, or how does that process work?
So we are not currently serving all the kids in care. Statewide, we're on about 60% of the child welfare cases. A lot of counties where we serve are serving 100% of the kids in foster care, but many don't. And the main reason is because we need more volunteers. And so all children and youth in care have to have, by law, they have to have a guardian ad litem that is appointed by the court to represent the best interests of the child. And so that is generally the role that CASA plays in cases. So we basically help fill a role that's already required by law. And then, we're volunteers, so we get to spend a lot of time. Generally, volunteers only have one or two cases, where you may have attorneys or caseworkers that have, 15, 20, 25 different cases and families that they're working with. And so the advantage of having a volunteer is that you have one person who's really just dedicated to your case, and that's all. And so it's a really great benefit to the court, but also a great benefit to children and families. And, really what we need is more volunteers across the state.
Yeah. I was going to even ask, so like, that seems like a really, like, even as a social work student myself, and for our listeners who are social work students, if they're trying to figure out a way to advocate for people or for children, I feel like this is a good way, becoming a volunteer at Texas CASA, because that's exactly what you're doing. You're advocating for children. But so for the people, I know Texas CASA probably accept volunteers that are not really in the social work field. So how does the training for them look like? Because they're doing an important role advocating for children. So I know they're just not thrown into that. So what does like the training process for them look like? If you could just give us a brief overview.
Yeah, so CASA volunteers are required to get over 30 hours of training. Some programs have upwards of 40 hours. And basically you learn about the history of the child welfare system. You learn about the child welfare system and the legal process here in Texas, which is a little bit different than other states. And you learn, we do have some training on trauma. We have some training on recognizing your bias and those kinds of things. And then we also require 3 hours of court observation. And then we also have a requirement for our volunteers to get at least 12 hours of ongoing training every year. So that, you know, we kind of make sure that we're, that volunteers, you know, are constantly learning and growing. And then we also, the main role that the volunteer or that the local programs play is they have volunteer supervisors who are professionals that help support volunteers, answer questions, make sure volunteers sort of know what they're supposed to be doing, all of those kinds of things. We do have a lot of volunteers that are social workers. I'm a volunteer, I'm a social worker. But yeah, to your point, I think a lot of folks are just people in the community that care and want to make a difference. But I do think it is a great opportunity for social work students if they're interested in learning, like, do I want to work in the child welfare system? A lot of caseworkers are obviously are obviously still social workers. So it's a great way to sort of figure out and, you know, get real experience on the child welfare system and see if that's a good fit for you without necessarily, you know, going through the whole process of getting a job and then discovering if it's a good fit or not.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah. So like you mentioned that you're a volunteer yourself. So how many, first of all, I like the fact that you guys do train the volunteers and they're just not thrown into it, because I feel like sometimes that happens. You mentioned that, you know, the children may already have caseworkers, and some caseworkers may just be thrown into it and just get a high amount of cases, and they're not really able to focus on that one child. But you guys offer, you know, intensive training, and then the volunteers only have like a maximum of two cases, which is pretty good. So for you, since you've been a volunteer, how long have you been a volunteer for, and how many cases have you had?
So I've been a volunteer for almost 11 years. So I was a volunteer actually before I started at Texas CASA, and it was one of the main reasons I wanted to join Texas CASA, because I understood the value of the volunteers and wanted to work, you know, for the statewide organization on policy issues related to the child welfare system and supporting CASA. I think I've had now 4 different cases. My first case was a sibling group of 5 children, and 4 of them were adopted pretty quickly after mom's rights were terminated. But the oldest one had experienced the most significant amount of trauma. And so I actually was on his case for a little over 7 years. Mm-hmm. And, you know, throughout that time, he had a lot of different caseworkers and people kind of coming in and out of his life. And it was really meaningful to kind of, you know, grow up with him a little bit. By the time he was adopted, he, I had known him for over half his life. And so that's really, meaningful. Obviously, it's not ideal for a child to be in care that long. And that's something that I still think about a lot. What could I have done to get him out more quickly? But I do know that I was a really consistent person for him throughout that time. And, that really helped make a difference. And in that case, ultimately, we went back and looked at his original biological family. And he was able to be adopted by his grandfather. And one of the things that is really great about CASA is that we do a lot of family finding and family engagement. And that's a really big priority for us, for kids to be with their biological family members, if it's at all possible. And so what's great is that sometimes you can go back, it's been a few years, circumstances have changed for a family. Let's go back and see if there's a possibility now that maybe wasn't there before. Mm-hmm. And that's what we were able to do for that kiddo. And it was really, really special and healing for him, that he knew he was able to learn that his family loved him the whole time and missed him the whole time, and still wanted him. And, I think because he saw his younger siblings be adopted, and he really felt that on a deep level, right? Like that was an additional rejection that he kind of carried around with him. And so to be able to reconnect him with his biological family was really super meaningful. So that goes way beyond what you asked me about, but
that's great.
It's a really important and great opportunity. And I think something that I probably got a lot more out of as an individual than I was able to contribute, right? It's one of those experiences. But yeah, super meaningful.
And that's a great story, because I was just thinking, in one of my classes that I'm taking right now this semester, our professor was mentioning how like a high percentage of the children in the foster care systems, they don't get placed with their families, although they might have families living in their very neighborhood. Some foster children, they grow up and they realize, oh, I had a family right here in the very neighborhood I grew up in, but they weren't placed with them. And I think like volunteers within CASA, they do that work that helps them find their family and they get placed with them, like the story you just mentioned. So that really like just kind of gave me hope. And that's a great story. And it actually really sparked my interest. And I don't know if it's sparking the interest of some of our listeners, because I'm going to go look into Texas CASA after this and see if it's something that I'm interested in doing, because like you said, it seems like a really great, valuable volunteer opportunity. So thank you for sharing that with us. So now that we know a little bit about Texas CASA, I just want to get to know, what do you do like on a daily basis at Texas CASA in your position? Can you provide us like a brief overview on what an overall day looks like for you?
Yeah. So one of the great things about my job is that every day kind of looks a little bit different. During the legislative session, I am super busy and down at the Capitol basically every day, working on different pieces of legislation that either we bring forward or are filed related to child welfare. And, working to see if it's good legislation, like we're really supporting it, we're trying to get it passed. And if it's legislation that we have concerns about, we're trying to get it changed, or, see if there's a way that we can stop it from going through. And then, one of the things that's really interesting, and I don't think a lot of people realize, is that they sort of think like, oh, the law passed, like, great, mission accomplished. But actually, the most important aspect of policymaking is really in the implementation of the law. And so a lot of our work is around making sure that legislation gets implemented. A lot of laws pass and then actually never really go into effect. And so it's super important to hold the state agencies accountable, make sure that they're doing everything that's required by the law. commenting on rulemaking, participating in work groups that are all about sort of implementing the law, or are generating ideas for how, for legislation that might be needed. Like, so for example, right now I'm on a work group that's focused on kinship care, which is the term that we use in child welfare for placing kids with their family. And we're looking at what are the barriers for kinship caregivers, and what can we do as a state to not only increase the number of kids that are placed with their families, but then promote success of that placement once kids are placed with their families. A lot of our families have, significant financial barriers to just taking on a sibling group of 3 kids all of a sudden, right? Like, that's not something they were planning, and probably not something that they can necessarily afford. And so what can we do as a system to sort of like wrap around that family, make sure that it's a successful placement? And so, there's work groups like that. During the interim, there's hearings that happen. There's always reports coming out about different aspects of the child welfare system. There's federal legislation that we look at that needs to be implemented here in Texas. And then, there's just issues that are kind of always coming up, right? It's sort of never a stagnant thing. So we might have suddenly a big increase in children that don't have placement and are sleeping in CPS offices, for example. So then we sort of drop everything we're doing and try to work on that issue. And so we work with a lot of other child welfare advocacy organizations. I'm in a lot of different coalitions that are focused on improving different aspects of the child welfare system, from like education to placement to, doing a better job of supporting families to try to prevent kids from needing to come into the child welfare system. So it's a lot of reading and writing of emails, participating in meetings. I would say you definitely need to be a little bit of an extrovert if you want to work in policy, because you do really interact with so many people. And I love that aspect of the job. Like, it is, you talked about clinical skills really transferring over. And I think that's really true. You have to be able to build and sustain relationships with people. You have to be able to read people and understand sort of where they're coming from. And it takes a lot of practice to, hear a perspective from a legislator that you may find like deeply offensive. And you need to sort of still meet them where they're at and help them understand why an issue might be challenging, and, see if there's a way that you can come together. And, all of those skills are soft clinical social work skills that you really have to hone and work on, as much as anything. So I do think the other thing that's important is staying connected to the social work field, right? If you're out making policy and you're totally disconnected from what people are actually experiencing in the child welfare system or in any system, and you're not talking to the professionals that work with families, then you're probably passing legislation that's maybe not getting to the heart of the issue, or may have unintended consequences and make things more challenging. So that partnership between macro and micro social work is super important as well.
That's true. So you did mention several things that stood out to me. So first of all, your day is very diverse. I think we kind of know that now, since we've been doing our interviews. A lot of macro social workers says that every single day is different. So that's a good thing, because I'm the type of person, I want every day to be different. I don't want to do the same thing over and over. So I think that's a really good thing about being in the macro field. Every day is different. And you also mentioned that what is the law? One of the questions that I got, what is the law if it's not implemented. That's like the most important part about policy making, like making sure that that law that even passes is being implemented, because there's some great policies out there, believe it or not. But the thing is, we don't see them, and we're just like, oh, we need a change. But it's like there's already a policy that has been created and signed off on, but it's not being implemented. And
Right.
then you also mentioned another thing in regards to just I'm just glad that you're doing what you're doing, because recently in my class I learned about how, you know, in the foster care system, you were mentioning that you're working on kinship placements right now, that when children are placed with their kins or their relative, they don't get that monthly stipend that will go to another family that's not their relative. But you just mentioned that sometimes, you know, a relative is not able to take on like 3 children. You know, nobody, I don't think anybody really is able to just take on 3 children. It's easy, especially in this world that we live in. So it's like, why aren't they getting some type of stipend, or why aren't they getting anything right now, you know? So I'm really glad that you're working on things like that. And your day as a social worker, as a macro social worker, does seem diverse, which is great. So how does the work in this organization fit your professional mission or experience? Did you always know that you were going to work with children and families? Did you always know that you were going to work at this level?
I don't think I knew exactly, what issues that I wanted to work on. I knew I wanted to work, like I said, on social justice issues. I knew I wanted to work at the systemic level. But, I didn't know if I wanted to work on women's issues or, immigration. I think there was just a lot of opportunities, and I was interested in a lot. I think one thing a lot of social workers have in common is sort of we care about every single thing. And I definitely am one of those social workers. And so, I think what's really unique about child welfare, though, is that you actually get to work on so many systems, right? Like kids in the child welfare system are on Medicaid. And so you got to work on Medicaid and improving Medicaid services. And, the shortage of providers is, something that we talk about all the time, right? And then you work on education issues. Children and youth in foster care are, experiencing huge barriers to high school graduation. And we have only like 3% of children and youth that leave foster care at 18 go on to get any kind of secondary education degree, even though in Texas we pay for their education fully up through the PhD level. We just don't see kids willing or able to take advantage of those benefits. And then, we also work on substance use issues and domestic violence, and a lot of the challenges that families are experiencing that lead to them interacting with the child welfare system. So it's a really unique area of policy, because there are so many aspects to creating a successful system, right? Like we sort of think about often social workers talk about the criminal justice system being like the mental health provider of last resort. And for children, the child welfare system ends up being, the provider of last resort for a lot of families. Like they're not able to access a lot of mental health services or substance use services. But if you interact with the child welfare system, you get bumped to the top of a lot of wait lists. And so, I think it's just, it is a really unique and important area of policy. And as I've worked on it more, I just get more invested in improving things. Because I think, especially for children, there's so much hope, but there's also so much possibility that things could go wrong, right? Like we have so many kids who are in the child welfare system whose parents were also in the child welfare system when they were growing up, right? And so we see that cycle happen in the child welfare system, very similar to what happens in the criminal justice system. And So it's just a huge opportunity. Like there's so much hope, but there's also so much room for us to do better.
Yeah. So like I think basically what you said is that although you weren't, it's not that you were necessarily driven to this field, like you had a passion for to do many things, several things, but within this field, it's so broad, you get to work in like different aspects, different areas like Medicaid, within like with criminal justice, with law. So it's kind of like a broad field, although you're in it right now. So that's
Mhm.
really good. That's good to know about the children and family field because that's the track that I'm on. So I'm always telling people like I want to do a lot of things. So they're like, "What do you want to do? What do you want to do when you graduate?" I'm like, "I want to do a lot of things." But knowing that the field that I'm going to is going to give me that exposure, it's really great to know.
Mhm.
So now let's move on to our advocacy questions. So you've shared with us, several stories already, but I know that you have more. So there are many ways to remain politically engaged. So in your personal life, what are some of the ways that you choose to remain politically engaged?
Yeah, so I'm a deputy voter registrar. I'm on team. Everyone should vote. I think it's really important. And one thing that you quickly learn and work when you work in the policy arena is that local politics matter, and they actually affect our daily lives. A lot more than like the presidential election, right? But when we look at voter turnout, we see like most people vote in the presidential election, but they don't necessarily vote in like the bond elections or even in local, state and senatorial races. And so I think it's really important to vote and stay engaged, stay knowledgeable about sort of local politics. As a lobbyist, as a registered lobbyist, you have to be really careful and how you express your political views publicly, just because people are paying attention to what you put on the internet all the time. And so I do think I'm limited in some ways in like what I can post on social media and things like that, but I think getting people registered to vote, I definitely have been known to schlep on down to a rally or two to participate in some rallies and things like that. But then also I think it's, talking to my family and friends and making sure they know what's going on at the Texas Capitol. I think it's really easy to pay attention to sort of what's happening on the national political stage, but I would encourage everyone, if you're not paying attention to the Texas Tribune, I think that's like the greatest resource that we have for understanding what's happening at the Texas level and at the Texas Capitol. Texas makes the national news a lot for its local politics, but there's a lot that doesn't make the national news that's still really important to know about.
That's true. I like how you mentioned talking to your family and friends, which is really, I think that's a really good way to do advocacy because some people don't know, because some people, they try to stay away from the news and media because sometimes it may be overwhelming or too disheartening. So like, just keeping people informed in your circle, I think that's really important. And I especially like when I receive information from people and then, I go and verify it versus sometimes I'm not even gonna lie, sometimes I don't watch the news. Sometimes I don't want to know what's going on. So if somebody, comes in, like have a conversation with me in regards to what's going on, I'm like, oh, really? Then I look into it, I'm like, oh wow. So I really like your form of advocacy in that respect. So what simple advice would you give social work students who want to get involved with policy?
I would say, set yourself up for success by making sure you get a great field placement. I think that internship is super important. There are a lot of different volunteer opportunities and internship opportunities. If you think you want to work in the Capitol, I would say try to get an internship in a legislative office. Even if it's a legislative office that doesn't necessarily hold your political views, it's really great experience. And you will see if, it's something that you want to do or not. And, I think most House members, so most representatives, most of their staff during the session are actually interns. And so it's a great way to sort of get involved. And then, I would say, try to develop relationships, right? Like that's what it's all about. That's how you get jobs. That's how you affect change. And so, even if you're not in Austin, developing relationships in your local community, do some community organizing, maybe see if the city council member where you are needs an intern, right? Like I think taking advantage of those kinds of opportunities to build your resume and build relationships at the same time is super, super important.
I like that advice, building relationships. What came to mind for me is I was just thinking about Martin Luther King. He was one person, right? But he had so many people behind him. He had so many people marching with him. It wasn't just him. It was a lot of people because of the relationships that he had built. And, change doesn't happen with just one person, although we may want it to, but it takes more than one person. So therefore, relationships are definitely necessary when we're talking about advocacy. So if you could start all over again with political social work, what would you do differently?
That's so interesting. Maybe I would have gone to graduate school a little earlier than I did. I took a couple of years off after undergrad, sort of like figure out what I wanted to do and try to get some experience. So maybe I would have gone a little earlier. But, I don't know. I think I've had a great career so far. I really have enjoyed everything that I have done. I would say, even moving here from Michigan, I got my first job from an internship that I had during graduate school. They had an affiliate here in Texas, made a call, and I had a job before I got here without really having to do a ton of work. And so, I do think, not to harp on the relationships piece, but that's really what it's all about. And so, I don't know. I think Texas politics I tell people this all the time, like it might be harder to work in DC in that political space, but also it might not. Like Texas is like up there in terms of just like the most challenging, one of the most challenging political environments to work in, especially as a social worker. And so, I think make sure you surround yourself with people who care about you and that you can, confide in. So, I don't know. I think I'm pretty happy with where my career has gone so far. And, I really got lucky, I think, because I was able to just, I had some mentors who advised me on the types of field placements that would be good for me based on, my interests and things like that. But I don't know. I don't know what I would have done differently. I think it's been a pretty good ride so far.
And that's good. And that's acceptable. But you did mention you would have went to graduate school earlier. And I just thought from what I grasped from that is just you would have empowered yourself earlier in order to do the work sooner. And I think that's super important. We need to empower ourselves with the tools that we need, because advocacy is work and it's actually hard work. And you don't want to just go out there with no tools in your hands. You need a tool belt. You need the tools. So just empowering yourself as soon as possible. As soon as you know that you want to do advocacy, go ahead and start empowering yourself. And you can do that in several ways. Going to school, websites and stuff like that. So there's so many ways to empower ourselves to be better advocates. So
yes. Yeah, I think you said it. You pulled out exactly. Yeah. I do think, believing in yourself. I was scared, actually. I wasn't sure if I would get into a social work program because I didn't have a social work background in undergrad. And so I was a little bit nervous about that. It turns out that social workers really want people to be social workers, and it was not like a crazy horrible, I was like, I'm going to get rejected from all these social work programs, which luckily didn't happen. But yeah, I think there was a little bit of like hesitancy and fear. So I think, yes, I would have empowered myself earlier to start this journey.
That's good. So we kind of mentioned it a little bit, but I kind of want you to elaborate on it because I know a lot of people struggle with this. We live in an information overload society. There's so much information around us 24/7. So how do you manage? Because I know that in order to do advocacy work, you need information. You can't just do it aimlessly. So how do you manage information overload in a society that overloads us with so much information?
Yeah, I think it's important to actually limit the sources that you get your information from, right? So I get a lot of information from my colleagues and people that I work with, and like from different organizations. But then, like I have a few news sites that I pay attention to, and I just kind of don't pay attention to any, like a lot of other ones, right? So like I mentioned, the Texas Tribune, I think the Dallas Morning News and the Austin American Statesman, like really reputable news sources that are going to give you the kind of information that you need to effectively do your job, right? So for me, I need to know what's going on in Texas politics, and those are all great sources. I would say Twitter is also super important. A lot of legislators use Twitter to like announce the interim charges for the Senate and things like that. And in that case, you sort of are getting information from the horse's mouth a little bit. And so, I would say Twitter is an important source of information, but only if you are trying to get something from the source, right? So I wouldn't say to listen to everyone on Twitter, but if you want to know sort of what Dan Patrick is working on, like Dan Patrick will tweet about what Dan Patrick is working on. And so that I think is a key way. Signing up for press releases from different, like from the office of the governor and the lieutenant governor. It's another great way to get information. But I would say, figure out try to just like tune out the rest, because I do think that you can get overloaded. And as social workers, we tend to get upset about every issue, or at least I do. And so it's helpful for me. I get one daily email. It's called The Skim, where they send me like national and international headlines, but it's like funny and satirical, and it's like a little bit lighthearted.
Yeah.
So I get my daily dose of what's happening nationally and internationally in like a short email. And then I don't check any national news sources. So, I think figure out what works for you, but make sure you're getting your sources for either firsthand or from reputable news sources.
Thank you. So basically, one, figure out what works for you, and you can also choose what you don't want to take in. Like you don't have to take in everything. And it's important, you probably want to choose what you don't want to take in so that you know that when you come across that thing, you don't necessarily need to read it because you have already chosen not to take it in, because you don't really need to take in every bit of information. You just have to find the ones that works for you, that gives you the information that you want, and then just use that. So I'm gonna actually one more question. You kind of already mentioned a few good resources already, but in your opinion, what's the number one website that helps social work students with political social work or advocacy? And how does this website help?
So I think if you're a social worker and you want to get involved in advocacy, I would say get hooked up with the National Association for Social Workers Texas chapter. I work closely with them. They work on a variety of issues here in Texas, and they really represent not only social workers, but social justice. And they do a great job of that. And they have a lot of different ways for social workers to get involved in advocacy. And so I would say follow them. And then if you want to know what's going on in Texas politics, the Texas Tribune is the source, I would say. I don't work for them, so it sounds like I'm like getting a little stipend or something, but I don't. I just know that that's something that I've learned just throughout my time here. It's sort of like they get the scoop on what's going on in Texas politics, and that's their whole focus, really, of their news cycle.
Okay, so the Texas Tribune and the NASW Texas chapter, those are two good resources, and I'm pretty sure they both have a website for students like me and students like our listeners to go check out and get some information on. So thank you so much, Sarah, for spending time with us today. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Social Work Amplified. I hope you were able to learn something today that empowers you to become more politically engaged and helps you shape a better tomorrow. Until next time.